Today we're continuing on in our first unit, but instead of looking at what we might call metaethical positions, like moral nihilism or moral relativism, which state that there is no fact of the matter about what's right or wrong, and morality is just relative to your culture or society, respectively, we're actually going to jump into ethical theories today. So now we are going to begin the part of the first unit where we actually look at a bunch of views that try to explain to us what makes an action moral or immoral. And all of these views are going to have a few things in common. They're all going to be realist views, so they all agree that there's a fact of the matter about what is moral or immoral. They just disagree about what that looks like. And, generally, they're all going to also agree that morality is objective. That is, it doesn't depend on what we think or believe. There's a fact of the matter about what's right or wrong, regardless of what our preferences are. And they're going to agree that morality is universal. So it holds for all people at all times. Murder didn't suddenly start becoming immoral in the 1950s. It was always immoral to murder, and it will always be immoral to murder. So, the theories that we're going to look at in the rest of this unit: Kant's view, which is known as Deontology, utilitarianism, virtue theory, ethics of care, egoism, and divine command theory. All of these views are going to say that morality is objective, it's universal, and they're just going to disagree about what makes an action moral or immoral. Does that make sense? Okay, so today we're looking at Kant's view, which is known as deontology. But before I get into his ethical theory, let me tell you a little bit about the person. Has anybody here heard of Immanuel Kant before? Yeah? What have you heard in regards to him? Have you just heard of him?
In our Digital Society class yesterday, he was brought up about a view of him religion, but I can't remember who he was right now.
Okay. He was a religious guy, although when you read his philosophy, you might not get that, because he tends to try to explain things in a very logical and analytical way. He doesn't make much reference to Scripture or the Bible or anything like that. He was a German philosopher writing during the Enlightenment period. Does anybody know anything about the Enlightenment? Have you heard this before? This period in European history. The Enlightenment, which we could say was, roughly the 17th and 18th centuries, was a time period in which there was an explosion of knowledge and invention, especially in the fields of science, mathematics, architecture, accounting, engineering, anatomy, biology, chemistry, etc. And what characterized the Enlightenment as a period in Western history is that, to kind of oversimplify, a lot of these thinkers were trying to throw off the dogmatic shackles that were placed on them by mythology, cultural tradition, and religion. Although a lot of the thinkers during this time were religious and were in fact Christian, they were tending to try to understand the universe through critical thinking, logic and reasoning, rather than just taking things on faith. And we see that trend also in Kant's philosophy. It is a very analytical philosophy that is going to utilize reason as its primary way to understand things and make sense of the world. You don't need to know this, or you don't need to memorize this, I should say, because this isn't an intro class or a German idealism class. But one of the things that Kant is famous for is his attempts at trying to synthesize two what were thought of as incompatible philosophical views at the time. Views about how we obtain knowledge of the universe and what kind of knowledge we should rely on. Thus, in philosophical jargony language, we can say he attempted to synthesize the rationalist position and the empiricist position through his theory of transcendental idealism, which would come to influence countless philosophers after him. Kant was a really big deal, okay? Everybody was reading Kant, and Kant would come to influence philosophers that you've heard of today through the next 3 centuries, and he continues to influence people today. Just as we talk about there being kind of a jump in philosophy during the time of the ancient Greeks, we talk about there being pre-Socratic philosophers and post-Socratic philosophers. We also talk about in philosophy the pre-Kantians and the post-Kantians. So this guy was a really big deal. Okay? The figure that we're looking at today has been extremely influential in philosophy, and his ideas are still being discussed and researched today. Now, what's interesting about Kant is the work that we're reading today is one that he wrote after engaging in an 11-year-long reading project. Has anybody here heard of the philosopher David Hume? Scottish philosopher? Hume was incredibly important for bringing up a wide range of philosophical problems and discussing them. Well, one of the views that Hume put forth in his philosophy was that morality was just a matter of taste or preference. Some people have a preference that murder is bad. Some people have a preference that murder is sometimes good and justifiable. Hume thought that this is basically what morality amounted to. When we make moral judgments, when we say you should or shouldn't do something, we're just expressing like a taste or a preference that we had. Well, Kant didn't like this, okay? This did not ring true for him. Being a guy who came from a religious family, Kant was taught that morality was objective, okay? That there were facts of the matter about what it was moral and immoral. It wasn't just a matter of taste or preference. And so, he went on an 11-year-long reading project of this guy, of David Hume. Can you imagine reading one person for 11 years straight? Just to try to undermine their view and understand their view better?
I mean, if it's all for spite, you gotta respect that.
It wasn't spite. I think it was born out of like a real desire to like try to justify his own beliefs, and come up for arguments with them. Come up with arguments for them.
Why don't you focus on one guy particularly, not multiple guys?
He was so shaken by this view. Because the way that Hume was writing, he was making it sound convincing. But Kant thought in his heart, this can't be true. Like, this view just can't be true. And so he devoted himself to this reading project. And what he tries to do in this work, after doing this extensive research and then writing all this stuff down, is he tries to reconcile Christian morality with logical and analytic philosophy. Okay? So again, I told you before, he comes from a religious family. He wasn't just going to accept what the morals and the view of morality of Christianity on faith. What he actually tries to do is provide arguments for this Christian view on morality. He tries to reconcile, in other words, religion and philosophy, which is something that people have been trying to do for hundreds of years in various disciplines. We'll see if you think he's successful here. In any case, we can see that Kant was definitely a man of his time. He was somebody who was highly influenced by the religion of his day, the cultural tradition of his day, although he used his genius intellect to pave new paths forward in philosophy. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay. One thing that I think it's important you understand about Kant, if you're going to understand his view, is where he's coming from with respect to why he was so shaken up by Hume's view. up until the Enlightenment period, I would say, much of Europe was Christian. It accepted the Christian presuppositions and worldview. Okay? It accepted the Christian doctrines. And what does Christianity say? Well, this world of physicality, of flesh and blood, of matter, is not all that exists. Right? There's also this other spiritual realm or non-material realm that exists, where God presides, where angels are a real thing, where there are demons, right? Where there's a heaven and a hell. Well, during the Enlightenment period, due to the scientific revolution, this view that there's a material realm and an immaterial realm people started to lose faith in it. Okay? The rise of science and the explosion of the fields of natural sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, started to cause people to lose faith in this worldview. They started to think maybe all there is, the laws of physics and matter and energy and atoms. Maybe there's no such thing as the spiritual world, right? Maybe there's no such thing as God, as angels, as demons, as souls. Well, Kant was not of this mind. Okay? He thought, yes, it's obvious that if we study science, we can learn stuff about this material world. But there's also this whole other world that science does not give us access to. Okay? And so his philosophy is based on this idea that there are two such realms that exist. And that as humans, we have access to both of them in different ways. The world of space and time, of the physical laws of nature, of matter and energy, he calls that the phenomenal world. It's the world that we can see and touch, right? That we can sense. But then there's also the noumenal world, the world of things in themselves, of what the actual stuff is like, its objective nature that lies beyond or behind the appearances. Because we have reason, because we can critically think, we have access to both realms. So, in a way, Kant was kind of straddling the fence between the religious way of life and understanding of the world and this new scientific worldview that was emerging during this Enlightenment period. You can imagine Kant saying the following, and this was an idea that came up during this time. Okay? If we live merely in a world of causation, matter, energy, atoms, time and space, just the world that science tells us exists, then free will and objective morality aren't real. Can anybody see why this is true, or why this might be true? Just think about it a little bit. Can science give us any description of what makes an action moral or immoral? Why not? Why don't you think so? For some people it's obvious, but for a lot of people it's not, right?
You can't really measure something like that.
Right. Right, exactly, right? How do you measure like a moral fact? Can you see a moral fact under a microscope? Can you perform an experiment on morality in the lab? No, you can't. Right? So this emerging worldview at the time, this scientific worldview, it started leading people to believe that there is no such thing as an objective morality at the end of the day. And consequently, that we don't have free will. Why might people think we don't have free will if all that exists is atoms and matter and energy? Why might people think that?
I mean, if we truly have free will, then wait.
Why, if somebody accepted the purely scientific worldview, why might that cause them not to believe in free will?
Because there's a consequence after it?
Because there's no, like, your soul isn't made up of atoms, so, like, that, like, whole, like, subconscious thing you have goes away.
Yeah, you could think about it like this. The scientific view would have you believe all you are is a collection of atoms and chemicals. Right? Do atoms have any agency? Do atoms have any control over what atoms do? No, so then why would we have any control over what we do if we're just a collection of atoms? Right? Our body and brain are just doing what they're doing because of certain chemical and biological processes in the brain. And we don't have any control over that, right? It's not like we're like, yeah, I got to make the neurotransmitter go through the ion channel now. It's like, no, your brain's just doing brain stuff, right? You know, maybe everything that you're doing right now is just what your brain is making you do, right? In fact, you might think, according to the scientific view, there is no you, right? There is no self. If you're just a collection of atoms and chemicals, where is the you, right? It's just an illusion, a figment of your imagination. But Kant couldn't accept this. It didn't seem right to him, right? Does it seem right to you that there isn't a fact of the matter about what's moral or immoral? Does it seem right to you that you don't have any control over your life? It's not intuitive to us, right? And so Kant was like, okay, I'm going to follow this intuition. Why don't I believe in this scientific worldview? And are there any arguments in support of the idea that this worldview isn't true? I'm going to try to fish those out, tease those out. And that's what he's doing in this project, okay? So, this work has a funny name. It's called Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. What Kant is trying to do in this piece is he's trying to explain and uncover what the heck like a moral fact is. He's trying to provide a foundational text for an objective morality. If it's not something that science can get at, well, what the heck is a morality? What makes it objective? What are its features? What are its presuppositions and preconditions? This is what Kant is trying to uncover in this work. And so he says at the outset, his goal is to identify and corroborate, quote, the supreme principle of morality through reason and deduction. He's going to be trying to uncover what makes something moral or immoral just by thinking about it, by applying his reason to the problem. He's not going to take things on faith. He's not just going to accept other people's stories for what makes an action moral or immoral. He's going to try to divine an objective basis for morality and explain what the heck this thing looks like. And he's going to go about it in a very analytical way. Okay? He's a very mathematical, logical way of thinking. And so his project is a little strange because we're not used to thinking of morality or anything in human life like this. But Kant is looking around and he's like, I notice people are saying that people should do things and shouldn't do other things, that we make moral judgments of people, that we presume that there's a fact of the matter about what's moral or immoral. I'm going to try to explain what would have to be true for all of these activities to make sense. That's what Kant is doing in this work. In other words, he wants to explain what the preconditions for morality would have to be for our behavior, for our moral judgments, for our prescriptions. You shouldn't murder, you shouldn't lie. What all that would have to be like in order for those behaviors to make sense. Because this is stuff that we do, right? You tell your friend, you should go to bed before 3 a.m. You say, Becky, you shouldn't date that guy. Or, Greg, you should go lift today. You didn't lift two days in a row. Right? This is how we act. These are the things that we say. So if that is going to have any meaning, if that's going to make sense and hold any weight, what would have to be true? That's what Kant is investigating here. And so he puts forth an ethical theory in this book, which has become known as Deontology. Coming from the Greek root deon, meaning duty, this ethical theory stipulates that the morality of an action is determined by whether or not that action proceeds from the moral law. Or in other words, whether or not that action is our duty. It's an ethical theory that says you're doing something moral if you're fulfilling your duty. We have certain duties, objective duties, things that we ought to do. You're doing something right if you're doing your duty. If you're transgressing your duty, you're doing something wrong. Make sense? So his view is one that has to do with duties. He's going to say we all have certain duties. He's going to explain what some of those are. And then he's going to give us tests for trying to figure out whether or not an action is going to be moral or immoral. He's going to help us figure that out. After a very long-winded argument about what the nature of our duties are and how we can know that. Okay? All right. Riveting, I know. You're on the edge of your seat. To go back half a step, recall what I said about the Enlightenment period. This is a period in which science was exploding. People were applying reason to human problems. Okay, they weren't relying so much on faith anymore. Well, one of the things to come out of this period was this idea that the universe operates according to laws. Right? There's a law of gravitation. Right? There are laws that govern how protons behave. Right? How a proton and an electron interact. Right? How electromagnetic fields work. There's a law that says we can't go faster than the speed of light. Right? There are, in other words, laws that seem to be baked into the fabric of our universe, that things operate according to. That chemical processes, that atoms, that matter, that energy operate according to. Right? So, during this time, this view started to become popular. All things in the universe work according to laws or underlying rules. Well, Kant started to think, well, if that's true of physical phenomena, like atoms, like tables and chairs, what if that's also true of morality? Maybe morality, too, operates according to certain laws or rules. And this is something that he stipulates in this work. He's like, everything in the universe operates according to laws or rules. It's going to be the same thing for morality. Protons and electrons operate according to the laws of nature. Morality is going to operate according to what he's going to call the moral law. And so, like the other ethical theories we're going to look at, he also says morality is objective. It doesn't depend on what we believe or what our preferences are. And it's universal. It holds for all people at all times. Torturing an infant for fun was wrong in 1319, just as it's going to be wrong in 2077. Okay? Make sense? You understand what I mean when I say objective and universal? Picking out two different things here? Where Kant starts to, how we should say, invent is not the right word, add his own little spin to moral thinking, is he says that we can discover what the moral law is. That is, we can discover what the objective standard of right and wrong is and follow it through reason a priori. Does anybody know what this Latin phrase means, a priori? Anybody take Latin? It has, the word is in priorities that I'm thinking of. What this phrase means is prior to experience. Yeah, did you guys know it back there? You should have said it. Come on. Yeah, prior to experience. Basically, what Kant is saying here is we can figure out what's right and what's wrong through our reasoning capacities before we have any experiences in the world, before we actually go out and see any murders or see any tortures or anything like that. We all have rationality, and by using our rationality, we can figure out what's right and what's wrong before we actually see any theft or lying or murder or anything like that. We don't need to have any experiences out there in the world with other people to figure out what's right and what's wrong. This is kind of a bold claim, right? Does anybody agree with it? Yeah?
I do have a question on that.
Yeah.
How can we, so is it reason without having any knowledge, or like you can't have any predeterminations?
What this is saying is we can figure out what's objectively right and wrong without having any moral experiences. It doesn't. Moral experiences are not required for figuring out what's right and what's
But
wrong.
if you did have them prior to this, it wouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, it wouldn't be an issue. Yeah.
Okay.
You're just, you're lucky you got some knowledge, I guess. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, basically what this is saying is you don't need to have any moral experiences with people out there in the world to figure out what's right and what's wrong. You can figure it out yourself if you just think about things rationally in the proper way. And this is what he's trying to do in this book, right? He's just meditating on this, and he's going to try, through reason, to come up with what makes an action moral or immoral, without going out there in the world and murdering or dealing with anybody. And what he comes to is the realization that we have certain duties. And this is what morality is going to hang on to, according to Kant. We have certain duties to ourselves, to God, and to other people. For example, here are some of the duties that we have. We have a duty to preserve our own life. We have a duty to be kind and helpful where we can. And we have a duty, an indirect duty, he's going to say, to try to secure our own happiness. What's going to be interesting about Kant's project is that for him, what's right and what's wrong is going to be intimately connected to what's rational. These things are going to be related. Maybe you've never thought in morality in those terms before, right? But for Kant, what's right and what's wrong is going to be intimately connected to what's rational. Now, I told you before that Kant stipulates we can figure out the objective standard of right and wrong through reason a priori. Well, he explains this a little bit more. Imagine that there's an objective standard of right and wrong that exists in the universe. Okay? But that to access it, we need to utilize our reason in the proper way. And then we're given access to it. Okay? Kant calls this objective standard the moral law. For him, moral actions, that is, good actions, are motivated merely by respect for the moral law. And what he means by this is, if you're going to do a moral thing, for it to be 100% moral, you have to do it just because you realize it's the right thing to do. That's what's meant by mere respect for the moral law. So if you see an old lady that needs help being walked across the street, and you're thinking to yourself, oh, maybe I'll help her because she might give me a $5 bill, right? That might be good. Kant would say, if you do it for that reason, you're not doing as moral a thing as you could do if you just did it because it's right. So for Kant, the 100% pure moral actions are ones that are done just because you realize it's the right thing to do, not motivated by any desire or personal motivation or self-interest. What reason allows us to do, our logical faculties, our reasoning faculties, is it allows us to represent the moral law to ourselves. This is a word that gets thrown around a lot in philosophy, a representation. What is a representation? Something that stands for something else, right? What form do representations take in your mind? What was that? Yeah, it can be an image. Exactly. Just imagine a tree. Close your eyes and imagine a tree. What you're seeing in your mind's eye is the representation of a tree. Okay? Our reason allows us to form representations of this subjective standard of right and wrong. That's how we get access to it, and that's how we can reflect on it in our minds. If we weren't able to form a representation of the moral law, we wouldn't be able to think about it and reflect on it and question it and interrogate it. Okay? Our minds are filled with various representations of things. These representations are what allows us to think about things and turn things over and reflect in our minds and think through things. Okay? In order to know, however, what the moral law is, in order to know what is right and what's wrong, you need reason, Kant thinks. It is for this reason that Kant is going to say animals cannot know what's right or what's wrong. And furthermore, that only beings with rationality, like humans, only creatures with reason can be moral beings. He's going to say animals do not do moral or immoral actions because they can't figure out what's moral or immoral. We don't say the lion did an immoral thing by killing the gazelle, right? We don't say the bird did a bad thing by eating the bug in the sky, right? We're like, no, that's just what animals do, right? They don't know better. They can't know what's right or what's wrong because they don't have reason like we do. So for Kant, being a moral person is something only a rational being can do, something with reason. In other words, he's basically talking about humans, but technically Kant's view allows for the possibility that aliens could be moral beings if they also have reason. But we don't need to talk about aliens. So, for Kant, to further specify, two things are going to determine whether or not an action is moral or immoral. Here's what he says. An action from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose to be attained by it, but in the maxim, or the rule, or the principle, in accordance with which it is decided upon, and therefore does not depend upon the realization of the object of the action, that is, whether the person succeeds in doing what they set out to do. For the will stands between its a priori principle, which is formal, and its a posteriori incentive, which is material. Here we have Kant going off on a tangent in classical German logical speak, which is incredibly difficult to understand and follow, but you'll get it if you reread it after this lecture, and is at a crossroads. And since it must be determined by something, it must be determined by the formal principle of volition as such, when an action is done from duty, where every material principle has been withdrawn from it. And so, duty is the necessity of an action from respect for the moral law. An action from duty is to put aside entirely the influence of inclination, that is, personal desires, motivations, self-interest, and with it every object of the will. Thus, the moral worth of an action does not lie in the effect expected from it. That is, the morality of an action does not depend on what your goal is, and it does not lie in any personal desire or inclination. Nothing other than the representation of the moral law in itself, which can of course only occur in a rational being, insofar as it is not the hoped-for effect, is the determining ground of the will. This alone can constitute the preeminent good we call moral, which is already present in the person himself who acts in accordance with this representation, and need not wait upon the effect of his action. So Kant is saying a lot of things here, but let me break it down for you. The morality of an action is determined by two things. Because we are rational beings, we act for reasons. Okay, we do things for reasons. Principles motivate our actions. Okay, rational principles. Why did you come to class today? Well, one of the principles that you live by, whether or not you realize it or not, is I go to class on time because I'm trying to get a degree. Right? That's a principle you live by. Or here's another principle you live by. Some of you probably. When class gets boring, I look at random shit on my laptop. Like you're probably doing right now. Right? So, as rational beings, we live according to certain principles. If we're going to try to do moral things, we need to have the correct principles. Okay? Or maxim. That's the word that Kant uses. Maxim. It's a weird word. So, if you have the right principle, that's going to allow you to do the right thing. The morality of your action is not determined by your goal, and it's not determined by whether or not you achieve your goal. For example, some people think, oh, you know, what that guy did was good because he's doing it for world peace. That's his goal. Right? Kant is going to say, just because he is trying to do it for world peace does not make the action good. Okay? His action being good or bad is not dependent on what the person's goal is. And it's not dependent on whether or not you achieve your goal. For example, the firefighter rushes into the burning building to try to save a little kid, right? Let's say that he fails. He's not able to get to her in time. It collapses on her. She dies. Did the firefighter do a bad thing by failing to save the child? Did he do a good thing by trying to save the child? We want to say he did a good thing, right? But we don't say that because he saved the child. In this instance, he failed, right? So it's obvious that, at least for some actions, the morality of it doesn't depend on whether or not you were successful, right? It's what your principle was that mattered. Or, in layman's terms, your intention. Whether or not you did a moral thing is dependent on your intention. Did you have the proper intention going into it? That's the first thing. The second thing that determines the morality of an action is whether or not your action was motivated by any self-interest, personal goals, making money, anything like that. Okay? For Kant, the 100% pure moral action is one that you do just because you recognize that it's good, for no other reason. If you help the old lady across the street because you're trying to get money, your action was tainted a little bit by self-interest. Okay? If you're trying to solve world hunger because you know it's going to get you a lot of fame, your actions are tainted. Okay? The word that Kant uses for this is inclination. So, if you act out of inclination, your actions are cheapened. at least in the realm of morality. If you're trying to do a moral thing, you got to have the right principle or the right intention, and you got to just do it because it's the right thing to do and for no other reason. Okay? Now this is important. This phrase, and I'm going to test you on this because this is key in Kant's philosophy. You keep hearing this phrase pop up and you see it on the slide, from duty. An action from duty is a moral action. An action from duty is not the same as an action in accordance with duty. The firefighter trying to save the child is acting in accordance with duty. But he's only acting from duty if he's doing that because it's the right thing to do. If he's doing it for any other reason, say, I'm going to try to save this little girl because I know she's the politician's daughter and he's going to give me a lot of money for this, he's not acting from duty. He's acting in accordance with duty because his duty tells him you got to try to save the child, but he's not acting from duty if he's acting out of self-interest or personal motivation. Does that difference make sense?
Would in theory then his action be tainted by the fact that it is his job and that makes him money?
Well, it might be that sometimes the job that we have places duties on us, right? Like your job. Wouldn't you say that because you have voluntarily stepped into this line of work, you now have duties that you didn't have before?
Yeah.
Now, if you are just trying to save people because that's your job, then Kant would say, come on, man, you should save people because it's the right thing to do, right? This is the example I've been using, right? Walking the old lady across the street. We can tease out this distinction again here. Helping the old lady across the street is acting in accordance with your duties. You should do that if there's nobody else around and she needs help. But if you're doing it for money, you're not acting from duty. You're only acting from duty if you do it just because you recognize it's the right thing to do. That's it. That's the only reason. Does this make sense? Or we'll take one more example to help make it clear. You're a shopkeeper, okay? You run a little general store down there somewhere, okay? You are setting the prices of your goods. You're trying to figure out what to sell flour for, what to sell laptops for, what to sell, styluses for, whatever it is. You're thinking to yourself, should I charge everybody the same price for my goods? Or should I charge some people more if I know they have more money? You start thinking to yourself and you're like, I'm going to charge everybody the same price because I'm worried that if people find out I'm charging other people a lower price, I might get kneecapped. Somebody might come in and just destroy my shop or beat me up. So out of fear, I'm going to set my goods as the same price for everyone. Here, you're acting in accordance with duty because you should sell the goods to everybody at the same price, but not from duty. Why? Because you're setting that price out of fear, out of personal self-interest, out of personal motivation. You're not setting the price simply because that's the right thing to do. Does that make sense? Okay. So, continuing on, Kant is going to say, we know which actions are moral or immoral because morality is given to us through what he calls imperatives. What we've looked at so far is all fine and good, right? You got to have the right intention, and you got to basically do what you're going to do simply because it's good. But now, how do we recognize what the right principles are, right? And how do we recognize, which actions are good? We still might have a question about that. Well, luckily, Kant is going to provide us with 2 tests here coming up to figure out what it is that we should do in any situation if we want to be a good person. Okay? Here's what he says. The representation of an objective principle insofar as it is necessitating for a will, is called a command of reason. And the formula of the command is called an imperative. All imperatives are expressed by an ought, and indicate by this the relation of an objective law of reason to a will that, by its subjective constitution, is not necessarily determined by it. They say that to do or to omit something would be good, but they say it to a will that does not always do something just because it is represented to it that it would be good to do that thing. Morality, however, is that which determines the will by means of representations of reason, hence not by subjective causes, but objectively, that is, from grounds that are valid for every rational being as such. So here's what Kant is saying. When we're trying to figure out how to live our life, how to be good, we are entertaining a bunch of different principles, a bunch of different rules to live by, right? Should I live by the rule never lie, or should I live by the rule lie when it is going to protect someone's feelings, right? Here's the thing. Depending on what your goals are, what your aims are, what your dreams are, your reason is going to tell you to do certain things, right? It's going to be different depending on what your goals are. So if your goal is to have fun in college, reason is going to tell you, I don't need to pay attention in class. I'm going to play Minecraft on my computer, right? But if your goal, for example, is to get a degree and to get good grades, then reason is going to tell you, I should do my best to focus in class even though this Kant lecture fucking sucks. Okay, right? So depending on what your goals are, reason is going to tell you to do various things. The thing is, you can decide whether or not to follow what your reason tells you to do, right? You all have experience with this. Rationally, you should be going to bed at the same time every night, waking up at the same time every day, and you probably should be going to bed earlier, right? You know this. But do you listen to that? No, you stay up and you scroll on your phone and you watch dumb TikToks, right? So you can decide whether or not to listen to reason. What's special about morality is that when your reason tells you to do something in the domain of morality, it's not telling you to do it for this or that reason. Reason is just inspiring you to do the right thing simply because it's valid and good. In our lives, reason is going to tell us to do various things depending on the goals that we have, but every rational being just feels the pull of doing what's moral because that's a good thing in and of itself. It's valid for every rational being as such. That's what Kant is saying here. And continuing on, to separate these two kinds of commands that reason gives us, he says they command either hypothetically or categorically. The former represent the practical necessity of a possible action as a means to achieving something else that one wills. The categorical imperative would be that which represented an action as objectively necessary of itself, without reference to another end. This is morality. If an action would be good merely as a means to something else, the imperative is hypothetical. If the action is represented as in itself good, hence as necessary in a will in itself conforming to reason as its principle, then it is categorical. So, there are two kinds of imperatives that reason gives us. Two different oughts that our reasoning capacities give us. Okay? One is hypothetical. What reason is going to tell you to do, let's say you want ice cream, but all the delivery apps are shut down. What is reason going to tell you to do? Go to the store and get ice cream, right? That would be a hypothetical imperative. Why? Reason is only telling you to go to the store because you have the goal of acquiring ice cream. You could not have that goal. You could have a completely different goal, right? Maybe your goal is to lose weight. Then reason would say, don't go to the store and get ice cream, right? So, depending on the goals that we have, reason tells us to do certain things. Those are hypothetical imperatives because we could have other goals, right? We could have other aims. Morality is different. Morality comes to us in a categorical imperative. A categorical imperative tells us what's necessary to do simply because it's rational or good. I must be really funny. I see a lot of people smiling at me. Do I have something on my face? No? I'm just so animated and great, right? Do you understand the distinction between these two things? What reason is going to tell you to do is going to vary based on your goals. Those are hypothetical imperatives, right? If you want to make weight, say you're a wrestler, reason might tell you spit in a cup all day, right? Or don't eat all day. Whereas, if you want to live a happy, more comfortable life, reason is going to tell you drink when you want to drink, don't worry about spitting in a cup all day, right? Morality, however, we feel the pull to do what's moral simply because it's good and rational. That's it. Reason tells us to do what's moral, not for any other end, not to achieve any other goal. It doesn't have any goal beyond itself. It is a goal in and of itself. Does that make sense? Doing what's moral. And you all feel this, right? When you're trying to think through what to do in your life, when you're trying to think through, should I do the moral thing or not? It's not like you're thinking, if I do the moral thing, that'll get me all this stuff. You just feel the pull of doing the moral thing because the moral thing is good in and of itself. That's what Kant is trying to make explicit here. He's trying to make explicit this feeling that we all have that, look, you just feel like it's rational to do the right thing, even if it's going to come at a cost to you. Right? You feel the pull of telling your girlfriend the truth that you cheated on her just because it's the right thing to do, even though you know it's going to hurt you. Right? Duties, that is what is right, what we should do in our lives, take the form of the categorical imperative. We just feel the pull of duty. We just feel compelled to do our duty. We're not thinking beyond it when we're trying to figure out, if we're going to behave morally. Does this make sense? Okay. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, now we can talk about Kant's two tests for figuring out, what principles should I live by? What are the right principles? And which actions are moral? How do I know what is the right thing to do? Well, Kant gives us two. He gives us actually more than two categorical imperatives or formulations of them. But I'm only going to give you two because the third one's kind of weird. Okay? Kant says if you want to figure out how to live your life in a moral way, do this test. Act only according to that maxim, principle, or rule through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law of nature. I'm going to express this in a non-Kantian way so you actually understand. If you're trying to figure out what's moral, ask yourself, could everybody do this thing that I'm trying to do or I'm thinking about doing? It's that simple. Could everybody do this thing that I'm thinking about doing? Bless you. This is what's called universalizing your maxim. Okay? You try to imagine a world in which everybody did the thing you're thinking about doing. For example, your girlfriend tries on a dress, and she's like, do I look fat in this? And you're thinking to yourself, fuck, she does not look good. Like, do I lie to her? How do I spin this, right? Like, what's going on here? Do I tell her the truth? That's going to crush her. Like, she's been working really hard at the gym. Like, what do I do? Well, imagine a world in which everybody told lies to protect people's feelings. Could such a world exist? Either practically or logically. I'm going to take you down a weird train of thought here. Kant is going to say such a world could not exist. Do you want to know why? What's the purpose of lying? What do you cover the truth? Yeah.
Protect ourselves.
Yeah. You lie because you're trying to deceive someone, right? That's the purpose of lying, deceiving someone. Well, imagine a world in which everybody lied when they were trying to protect somebody else's feelings. Everybody is trying to deceive everybody else to protect their feelings. What would happen in such a world? People would start to not trust anybody, right? If everybody lied to protect other people's feelings, people would start to look at each other and be like, how do I know you're fucking telling me the truth right now? You know, I don't believe a word that you say. Everybody's lying out here, right? In a world in which everybody lied, deceit would become impossible because nobody would trust each other from the get-go. So if we tried to make lying a law of nature, like baked into the fabric of the universe, it would undermine itself in this scenario because nobody could be deceived in such a world after an amount of time. That doesn't make any sense. That's a contradiction. So we know the principle, lie to protect other people's feelings, is not going to promote moral actions. This maxim has been defeated because it cannot be universalized. Let's take another example. That's an example of it being defeated on what we might call logical grounds. Let's say you live according to this principle. Every Wednesday, I go to the university bookstore and I buy something for myself as a treat. Could such a world exist in which everybody did that? Why not? There's not enough to go around for everybody. How would we solve this transportation issue? We'd have to get people from all the other countries to the Seton Hill bookstore every Wednesday. No way to do that. There's not enough resources in the world, not enough time to do that. Right? Practically, this could not work. So, on practical grounds, the maxim, every Wednesday go to the bookstore and buy myself a treat, is defeated. Because you can't universalize that. Let's take another example I list here. Borrowing money. You're trying to figure out whether or not you should borrow money from your friend knowing you can't pay him back. Imagine if everybody lived like that. You want to live according to the maxim, borrow money even if I can't pay it back. Could everybody do that? Could you imagine such a world in which that was a law of nature? That's how everybody behaved. Yes or no? Why not? What's the problem with that?
There's literally not enough money to go around. If everyone owes everyone money, then it just kind of doesn't work.
There's not enough money to go around. Any other reasons? So there are practical issues with this being made into a law of nature, right? There's also a logical issue here. If everybody behaved in this way, borrowed money without the intention of paying it back, what would happen? The whole process of lending money, the activity of lending money, nobody would do it anymore. Because they would know, yeah, I'm not lending any money to you, you fucker. You don't pay anything back. Nobody pays anything back. I'm never lending money out again. Right? So this could not be a law of nature. It undermines itself. And laws of nature don't do that. They can't do that. Right? It's not like the law of gravitation is like, oh, someday I'm going to, hold, and other days I'm not going to hold. No, it always holds. But if there's a logical or practical problem with imagining a scenario like that, that maxim is defeated. It's not a good one to live by. It's not going to promote moral actions. Okay? And so it can fail on practical grounds, or it can fail on universal grounds, or logical grounds. One final example, because this is a weird way of thinking about what makes an action right or wrong, right? But it's kind of genius at the same time. Suicide. Let's imagine, some people think suicide is fine, right? You're like, yeah, it was the right decision for him. His life was really shitty. Well, let's imagine you tried to live like this. You want to live by the principle, kill myself when life gets too hard. When I feel that life gets too hard. Could we make this into a universal law of nature? Could we imagine a scenario in which every living creature killed itself when life got too hard?
There would be no living creatures.
There would be no living creatures, but check this out. This is a weird little logical argument. What are you doing when you kill yourself? You're willing yourself to die. You know what nothing can do if it's dead? It can't will itself to do anything. So willing your own death is like self-contradictory. Doesn't make any sense. It's like trying to use your life to snuff out your life. It's a logical contradiction there, Kant would say. And so what's interesting about this is going to lead Kant to some weird places. He's going to make some pretty strict claims. He's going to say suicide is always immoral. Lying is always immoral. Think about whether or not you agree with him on those things. But this is the first test that we can do to figure out how to do the moral thing, how to avoid the immoral thing. There's one other test. This one's a lot easier. Act that you use humanity always as an end, never merely as a means. In other words, never treat another person merely as an object. This one's really easy, right? Let's imagine I took one of you students up here and I just treated you like a chair. And I just sat on you and I scooted you around. Is that the right thing to do to you? No, it's wrong to treat people as objects, right? It's wrong to treat people merely as objects. Or let's say, let's say you're in a friends with benefits situation. And you're really only using him, that guy, to get off. You don't care about him. You don't care. When he texts you, you don't respond to any of his texts, right? You don't care about his feelings. You don't support him at all. You don't listen to him. You don't talk to him. You completely ignore him until you want to have sex, and then you go and do that, and then you leave immediately after. Is that the right way to treat someone? Merely as an object to get off with? Even people in friends with benefit situations would say no. Treating someone merely as an object is not right. This merely word is important. We cannot avoid treating people like objects. You're treating me like an object right now. Why? How? You're using me to get a degree. Just like I'm using you to get a paycheck. Right? But we're not merely using each other. Right? We have some respect for each other. Right? There are certain norms that we follow. We show each other a certain kindness. So you're not treating me merely like an object. I'm not treating you merely like an object. Or imagine you go to the store, right? You're using the checkout person to check out your groceries. But you're not merely using them. Right? You say, hi, hello. Oh, thanks, yeah, weather, weird, whatever. You talk to them, you show them a little bit of kindness. You're not merely using them like an object. So, we treat people like objects. We use people. Everybody does that. We can't avoid doing that. We just have to make sure we don't treat people merely as an object. Okay? That, for Kant, is what matters. That's another test that we can perform. Perform it in your life. If you're treating someone merely as an object, maybe that's a sign that you should change your behavior. Right? I don't know. What do you think of this test? Do you like it?
Pretty intuitive.
It's intuitive, right? Kant is going to say, look, this makes sense because all persons have an intrinsic value that ought to be respected. They have their own ends and goals. They are a living, rational thing that have their own dreams and desires. And when you treat someone as an object, you're treating them as if they don't have personhood or agency or goals and dreams. Make sense? Okay. What time does this class get out?
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. Good. We're almost done. You're like, I know it fucking sucks. I know. I promise you, the other views are going to be are easy to understand, okay? So here's just a summary of Kant's view, okay? The morality of an action is determined by the principle, and that should say degree to which the action is done out of self-interest, personal motivation, whatever. For Kant, you got to have the right principle, and you got to do it, the moral thing, just because it's the moral thing to do. Excuse me. If you're doing it to make money, to get famous, to acquire political power, that cheapens your action. Okay? We discover what morality is through reason, and it requires reason. If you're trying to figure out how to act in this life, you can do these two tests. Try to imagine a scenario in which everyone can do the action. If everyone doing the action undermines the activity itself in a logical way, you shouldn't live according to that maxim. If there are practical problems imagining your maxim as a law of nature, that also defeats it. Or you can even take the simpler test. Does the action involve treating someone merely as an object? If it does, don't do that thing, Kant says. To oversimplify, Kant says what makes an action moral or immoral is your intention. Did you have the proper intention? This means we can know what's moral or immoral before anybody does anything. All we have to do is figure out what their intention is. So what do you think of this view? Does it make sense to you? When it's simplified like that, maybe all of this crap is like, you're still like, ugh, I don't know what Kant's doing, weird German guy. Yeah. But like, does the overall sentiment make sense to you? Do you agree with it? Do you think the intention is what matters?
To a degree.
To a degree. Okay, say more, Brian.
Sometimes an action with the greatest intent for good can result in the greatest harm.
True.
So, like, if you give a kid wants to eat a lot of candy,
Yeah.
without any predisposed knowledge, you would think, okay, they enjoy that, that must be good for them. You give them a lot of candy. At the end, they have a bunch of cavities and they need to get all their teeth pulled.
Yeah.
My intent was to, like, have them enjoy candy, but it resulted in a lot of harm.
Yeah. Then we might question, did you actually have the proper intention in the first place?
Yeah.
You know? Maybe making people comfortable is not the proper way to treat them. Maybe the proper intention is to look after their well-being. Right?
That's something I run into with work all the time.
Right?
Good example, I had a lady the other day. She called after not being able to walk for 4 days.
Mm-hmm.
So she is on her couch. Her house is covered with cockroaches, and if you've ever seen Hoarders, it looks like that.
Yeah.
And she's stuck there. Well, we have to get her out somehow. And she doesn't want us to move her at all because everything we do hurts because she's covered in sores. and things are broken.
Right. Yeah. What do you do in a situation like that?
We have to give some sort of pain to get you out of here because
Right.
we can't just leave people.
Yes.
I do have a question regarding like Kant's view because you said he was like Christian, so like
Yeah.
how does like epistemology like into like whether your motives are like influenced by something?
That's a good question. So one of the things that he's going to say